I'm Scott Shue, a program director at ARPA-E. My fast pitch is titled Fusion Energy, Time to Swing for the Fences. I looked online for people's interpretations of this well-known metaphor. Many said it's giving your maximum effort to do something great. Others said you should get benched if you miss. In a way, this sums up the ongoing 7-decade saga to conquer controlled fusion. In this fast pitch, I argue that it's time to give fusion our maximum effort, and that the time has arrived for us to aggressively pursue fusion energy as a commercially viable technology through public-private partnerships, building on DOE's world-leading fusion science programs. Just to remind everyone, fusion is the process that powers the sun and the stars by fusing light elements like hydrogen into slightly heavier elements like helium, releasing a large amount of energy in the process. There is no carbon or fissile material like uranium anywhere in the process. There is no long-term radioactivity produced. Fusion has the potential to power the world in a sustainable way, virtually indefinitely. You've heard the joke that fusion is 30 years away and always will be. Unfortunately, that has been true. We at ARPA-E and many private fusion companies are making a push for timely, commercially viable fusion energy. Fusion is ready to break the cycle of ever-receding timelines for reasons I will describe in a few moments. Earlier in fusion's history, the receding timelines were largely due to unexpected scientific difficulties. Imagine trying to hold Jell-O together with rubber bands. That's a bit like trying to control hot fusion fuel so that more energy is released than invested. As scientists worked on this from the 1950s through the 1980s, the unruly fuel always found new ways to slip through their fingers and cool off. However, at a truly remarkable pace, exceeding even that of Moore's law, scientists plugged these holes one by one, coming to the brink of so-called scientific break-even in the 1990s. Though scientific challenges remain before we achieve and sustain high enough energy gain for practical fusion energy, much of the scientific discovery is behind us, and that is the most time-consuming and uncertain activity. From the 1990s onward, the receding timelines were due to the very high capital cost of taking the next step to surpass break-even, due in part to the limitations of enabling technologies, and our own unwillingness to take on higher technical risk to pursue lower cost paths to fusion. About 1 decade ago, as federal support for a diverse number of fusion concepts declined due in part to budget pressure, private investments in fusion started to ramp up in recognition of fusion's scientific readiness and enormous potential to tackle our energy challenges. Scrappy fusion startups accepted high upfront technical risks to focus on many fusion approaches with commercial potential, and they made steady progress despite little to no federal support. In recognition of the daunting technical challenges facing both the private fusion sector and the remaining path to a timely, commercially viable fusion demonstration, ARPA-E jumped into the fusion fray in 2015 with the ALPHA program to support science and technology that could lower the cost of fusion development. Many private fusion companies were among the ALPHA performers, like subsequent spin-out Zap Energy. ALPHA was followed up in 2020 by Beta, which supports an even broader range of lower cost approaches to fusion, and Gamov earlier this year to accelerate R&D in all the surrounding materials and subsystem technologies of a future fusion power plant. Surmounting these challenges will require the public and private sectors to work together. We have loaded the basis with mature science, investment by ARPA-E and Fusion Industry Association companies in a healthy number of commercially viable fusion approaches. You just heard from Bob Mungard of Commonwealth Fusion Systems. And last but not least, new enabling technologies such as high temperature superconducting tape and cables, advanced manufacturing techniques of complex parts and even large components, and many others that dramatically open up the design space for commercially attractive fusion. With these bases loaded, we are ready to swing for the fences. This is not an isolated opinion. The national academies just urged the DOE and private sector to work together to realize a fusion pilot plant in the 2030s. Other countries are already moving ahead with fusion demonstration activities. The United States must unleash our hard-won knowledge and experience to accelerate commercially relevant fusion development and demonstration, or cede leadership to other countries with not only energy security, but national security implications. We have the expertise in our national labs and universities to deliver innovations to solve the remaining challenges. We have the interest and commitment of the private sector, which has invested over $1.5 billion in fusion over the past decade. We should move quickly to make commercial fusion energy a reality. Fortunately, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are many examples of public-private partnership programs that could form the basis for new like-minded programs to accelerate the path to commercial fusion. Examples include the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program from the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy, with tiered private cost share requirements. The very successful NASA COTS milestone reimbursement program that helps SpaceX demonstrate its reusable launch vehicle at large savings to the government. And most recently, the ARPA-E scale-up program that connected technical performers with private investors and commercialization partners as part of the application process. Bottom line, we want to engage further with all fusion stakeholders, especially the private sector, to identify and implement the best suite of public-private partnership programs to accelerate commercial fusion development and demonstration. In the decades ahead, fusion has the potential to be a firm, socially just, zero carbon energy and heat source that will ease every path to global net zero. It will also enable new applications that are science fiction today, like crewed interplanetary space missions, and many more we haven't yet imagined. Thanks for listening. Please reach out if you are interested in helping fusion swing for the fences. Next, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jen Shafer.
I'm Program Director Jenifer Shafer, and I'm wondering, why can't we be friends? Technical approaches to rapid decarbonization are central to mitigating climate change. However, mitigating climate change may require technical and social advances. We can design the most technologically elegant solutions imaginable, but without public buy-in, they might never see the light or wind of day. As deployment of renewable energy grows in scale to address energy challenges, so does pushback regarding the size and placement of energy installations. Many of these discussions can be classified under a broad umbrella of NIMBYism. And ultimately, it would be an ARPA-E hard problem to get rid of NIMBYism, no? After all, why can't we be friends? To address NIMBYism, we need to address it just like we address other challenges as scientists and engineers. We need to look at the data, understand the issues, and find the solutions that work. To date, we know that increasing interactions has been significant in minimizing conflict and increasing buy-in on a whole host of complicated issues. Big data could be key to increasing interactions in a seamless and touch-free way to decrease the challenges posed by NIMBYism and provide the clean energy package of renewables plus nuclear necessary to address climate change. For this discussion, we need to consider the poster child of NIMBYism, nuclear energy. Nuclear receives this unceremonious title from someone, myself, who absolutely loves this technology. It's appropriate to consider nuclear energy because, one, as a country, we could currently deploy nuclear as a firm, clean source of energy to aggressively decarbonize as quickly as possible. And two, one could make the argument that nuclear is at the vanguard of unimpressive community outreach, siting, and public perception. Regarding public perception, did you know that per recent Twitter sentiment analysis, nuclear is less popular than the coronavirus? Such a sentiment is going to have natural consequences regarding the ability to site a given facility. So let's talk about nuclear siting to see if we can save deployment timelines for both nuclear and renewables. Siting of a nuclear facility requires community engagement through legislatively required town hall meetings. I would say these classify as the absolute bare minimum of outreach to get someone excited about a project in your town. Who gets excited about a 7 p.m. town hall meeting on a Wednesday? The number of people who are willing or able to participate in these meetings is a radically small percentage of the population. Some people have no opportunity to participate. They are working. Other people might have other conflicts or simply want an evening home with Bridgerton. All of these seem more compelling than an evening midweek town hall meeting that would only encourage the most disciplined of civic servants amongst us. One way that we could improve communication is by using big data to understand and incorporate the conversations that are happening outside of town halls. Understanding these conversations could be afforded through causal machine learning and Bayesian networks to get at the core of community or individual concerns. Big data could provide a higher level of granularity and accuracy beyond the generic concerns that are generally assumed to be problematic for a community, i.e., radiation is scary. Higher resolution is afforded by larger, easier to recover data sets, the ability to monitor perception over time, i.e. temporal evolution, and geographically specific information that ultimately might provide higher accuracy. By leveraging big data, a pathway for expediting facility siting by engendering community enthusiasm and empowerment could be developed while minimizing the social inequities that frequently arise when a facility falls under the broad umbrella of NIMBYism. Big data can be pulled from historic information and partnered with information in real time to understand the instantaneous concerns that might be relevant for a project under consideration. Big data can include historical town hall records, suits filed against relevant projects, as well as print and social media. Ultimately, the biggest benefit that big data provides is the ability to understand the broader conversation surrounding the technology or siting project. By understanding these conversations, more relevant dialogues can be had with stakeholders, and an opportunity presents to address concerns of the larger community that might not be able to make such a town hall meeting. By having targeted discussions, the timeline for project siting could be microwaved. Also, a pathway to rapidly conclude that a community will not buy into a project, regardless of adjustment to project dimensions, could be assessed, and this should also be viewed as a win. Big data could be used in multiple ways. In a first approach, big data could be leveraged to customize communication with a community. In a second approach, it could be used to understand how general conflicts with communities correlate to increased project timelines and costs. In a third approach, it could be used to more proactively understand the specific concerns of a local community to enable adjustment of project scope, scale, or aesthetics, and then to measure the effect of the proposed adjustment. By having substantially more interactions on a topic, the timeline for community buy-in could be expedited. Such a general model doesn't need to be explicit for just the nuclear industry, but could be relevant for any large-scale energy project that might potentially disrupt a community to make sure community concerns are understood. So in short, the hypothesis here is that large-scale energy projects, particularly nuclear, sometimes struggle to deployment because the conversations are too few and not too many. And ARPA-E wants to hear from you regarding your thoughts for big data to improve community engagement. For rapid clean energy to occur, these conversations need to happen more rapidly and with more relevance than has ever happened before. To facilitate this, technologies, algorithms, and data sets need to be developed to support the goals of a community that is not merely forced to transition to new energy technologies out of necessity, but can actively participate in the energy transition, thus enabling us to feel good on all fronts regarding what is happening in our backyard, ultimately enabling us all to ARPA-we be friends. I'm Program Director Jenifer Shafer, and I would love to hear from you regarding your ideas about how big data could help improve community buy-in to energy projects in your or other people's neighborhoods. And next, I'd really like to introduce Zach Fang, another Program Director at ARPA-E.
This is Zach Fang, a Program Director at ARPA-E. I'm here to pitch for hydrogen today, specifically pathways to low-cost green hydrogen. As you may already know, there is a third wave of hydrogen going on as we speak. You may ask, is the third wave the third time charm? Even though we know a lot about hydrogen, But are we doing enough to take advantage of hydrogen? Can hydrogen meet all our energy demand? Most of our energy demand today is covered by energy carriers. Interestingly, the history of energy is also the history of energy carriers. Biomass was the energy carrier for early human beings. Fossil fuel is the carrier of solar energy. You see, the energy carriers have evolved from coal to oil and to natural gas. The amount of hydrogen in these energy carriers increases from 0 to 4. Now, are we going to take the next step of this evolution to a complete hydrogen-based energy cycle? So why are we not using more hydrogen today? Of course, it is the cost. Although hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, it is chemically bound to water or hydrocarbons. A prime energy source is necessary to break the chemical bond to produce hydrogen. Of course, we only want to do that with water. And that leads us to the issue of how to split water more efficiently and cost effectively. The dominant method for the production of green hydrogen today is by water electrolysis. However, only a small fraction, less than 5% of the total 65 million tons of hydrogen produced annually worldwide is green hydrogen. And that is because the cost of hydrogen by water electrolyzers is still expensive, approximately $6 per kilogram. The encouraging thing is many countries and corporations are committing to build more green hydrogen capacity. Some 85 gigawatts of water electrolyzers have been committed to be built in the next decade. The hope is to drive down the cost of green hydrogen through the economics of scale. Many analysts are projecting the cost of hydrogen by water electrolyzers will be $2 by 2030 and $1 by 2050. These cost targets are remarkable goals, but it is still a very steep hill to climb. There are still many technical challenges. Of course, also opportunities. So in addition to water electrolyzer, are there any other methods that could potentially do better? There are indeed other methods for making green hydrogen. For example, solar thermochemical water splitting, photoelectrochemical water splitting, and biomass pathways to green hydrogen. None of these methods, however, are as mature as water electrolyzers today. They're even more expensive. So why are we still interested in them? Using the solar thermochemical water splitting as an example, the overall solar to hydrogen efficiency is significantly higher by using the solar thermochemical water splitting than using the water electrolyzer, something like 24% versus 13%. Of course, these efficiency numbers can change as the technologies evolve. Fundamentally, the decomposition of water to hydrogen and oxygen is thermodynamically impossible until extremely high temperatures, 4,500 degree Kelvin. That's practically impossible. So we must find ways to get around that. Two things must happen. One is we must provide external energy input. For water electrolysis, that's electrical energy. For solar thermochemical water splitting, that's a solar energy. Such energy input may also come from nuclear reactions, fission, and fusion. The second thing is we must find reaction pathways with significantly lower energy barriers than the straight decomposition of water. For example, for water electrolysis, that reaction is the reaction on the electrodes involving electrons. For solar thermochemical water splitting, the path goes through the redox reactions of metal oxides. These metal oxides with multiple valence states provide a detour from the starting point to the destination. Such detours enable the production of hydrogen without having to go to very high temperatures. So you may ask the next questions. Are there any other alternative paths that have lower energy barriers and could potentially produce hydrogen at a lower cost than the current methods? My answer is yes. However, we must focus on this challenging. The new reaction pathways may involve multiple steps, new catalysts, but they all must have to meet the requirements of having low energy barrier, have high energy efficiency, and a bottom line, be low cost. So finding such alternative reaction pathways is the ultimate challenge for hydrogen research. It is the holy grail for hydrogen. It is the call to action of this pitch. In many fields of materials research, we know that very often the case, breakthroughs are achieved only when a new reaction pathways is discovered. The same will happen and it must happen to split water to hydrogen. Finally, I leave you with this graph, the cycle from solar energy to hydrogen to deployable power and back to water. You see, the hydrogen energy cycle allows us not to emit any CO2 while meeting our energy demand. So it is the ideal approach for decarbonization. Just the cost of it still higher than fossil fuels. So we must do more. We must focus on finding that clever, maybe hidden, and perhaps radically different path towards low-cost green hydrogen. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Peter Debock, to be the next speaker.
We often talk about a future with green sustainable fuels, green natural gas, hydrogen, ammonia, or others. But elements that are not often discussed are the technology needs to make those fuels viable. My name is Peter Debock, and I'd like to talk to you about the technology needs of making future fuels energy dense enough for future aviation and shipping. This is done today through a process called liquefaction, which really means that you have to make these fuels very, very cold. And with this fast pitch, I want to invite you to join me in thinking about this space and to send us new ideas. It is exciting to be part of a generation where we slowly see an important part of our transportation system. Cars and light trucks, maybe even light aviation, switch to zero carbon emissions through battery energy propulsion, powered by renewable energy. Although we might wish that this approach could be applied to all transportation, the reality of the lack of energy density in batteries is that we will likely need chemical fuels for long-range aviation, heavy-duty trucks, and shipping for some time to come. We can already see today that some of these trends are occurring. The aviation sector is considering how to fly on hydrogen or other carbon-neutral liquid fuels, and the shipping sector has been making great strides in making future ships liquefied natural gas, LNG, ammonia, and hydrogen capable. However, these fuels of tomorrow will be significantly different than what we are used to, and they will require different treatment to be used effectively. And it's true that we don't know yet which fuels will be the eventual winners. However, what we do know is that likely they would need to be produced in a carbon neutral or carbon negative way and ideally get produced from renewable energy. And therefore, the molecules that will make up these future energy carriers will be smaller than the long organic compounds that make up kerosene, diesel, and gasoline today. I've illustrated what that means on this slide. Our traditional fuels are long molecules. They have many CH bonds, giving them high energy density, which means that they are also liquid at room temperature and pressure. Our newer future fuels, and some are sketched here, natural gas, ammonia, hydrogen, are all much smaller molecules, which means that these are in gaseous form at ambient conditions. And in order to get their energy density to where they need to be considered as transportation fuels, we need to pressurize them or cool them to very, very low temperatures to make them liquid. The arrows in this chart indicate the densification that occurs when you cool these fuels. For instance, volumetric energy density of natural gas goes up by 600 times when you go from gaseous form to LNG. But in order to do this, you have to cool it down to minus 162 degrees Celsius. Brr, that's very cold. And hydrogen needs to be compressed even more or cooled to an even lower minus 253 degrees Celsius. A frosty fuel indeed. And when liquefied, their volumetric energy densities are higher than the best batteries today, but the liquefaction process requires energy. And the fact is, we're not that good and efficient at cooling. When we produce 1 kilogram of liquefied natural gas, we require about 2,900 kilojoules of energy to do so. And this is about 6% of the chemical energy of that 1 kilogram of fuel. But it gets even worse when we get cooler. When you wish to liquefy 1 kilogram of hydrogen, you need about 36,000 kilojoules to do so, which reflects about 30% of the chemical energy in that 1 kilogram of hydrogen. So cooling is hard. And when you get to lower and lower temperatures, it gets harder. And the chart below shows that if you wish to cool at extremely low temperatures, you sometimes need 100 or 1,000 watts to remove even a single watt of energy from the fluid. The chart also shows that larger cooling systems are more efficient than smaller systems. And although that's not a problem today, it does limit where we can site and install these systems, which might limit the vision of distributed fuel generation. And to summarize the previous slide, with our current technologies, we'll lose a significant percentage of the renewable energy before we even get to the vehicle that we want to move. If you look at this giant solar farm, that means that 30% might be used just to get the fuel dense enough to be used for transportation. And there's potential to be more efficient. Therefore, we need to do better. If we look at the cooling process in general with a little bit more detail, we can identify that compression, expansion, and heat exchange between multiple refrigerant loops are the major contributors to inefficiency. And each of these processes have been around for decades, and typically, as a system, reach only 25 to 33% of Carnot energy efficiency potential. We want to know if there are different, more efficient ways to do this, and perhaps to do so in a modular, efficient way. We need to work together. So to increase the efficiency of cooling so that zero carbon fuels can become a reality. And while we do it, it would be great if large and small liquefaction could both be efficient. We're looking for new ways to compress and expand fluids. Some new ideas that could be interesting are the use of electrochemical compressing and no rotating parts and potential for different scaling rules in terms of efficiency and size. And another path that could be explored is the use of new computational methods to explore new refrigerant mixtures and thermodynamic cycles that are different, exploring to more efficient cooling. Lastly, I want to leave you with a vision expressed by Professor Leachman in a recent article of Colfax magazine, which I found quite intriguing. And in this article, renewable energy sources such as solar farms or wind turbines could become the fuel wells of the future, producing liquefied zero carbon fuels in the base, and all we have to do is send a daily tanker truck over to harvest the fuel. And if you like this vision or have innovative ideas to contribute to it, I'd love to hear from you. And just to illustrate that ARPA-E spans the entire temperature spectrum, my colleague Dr. Christina Chang will turn up the heat by talking about efficiencies of high temperature systems for metals extraction and processing. Take it away.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. Today I'll discuss how we can transform ores into metals using just air, water, and clean energy. Humanity expends 4% of energy use on a simple class of chemical reaction, taking rocks and separating them into their constituent components, mostly metals and oxygen. Why is this so energy intensive? Because metals and oxygen are more stable when combined. Now, today, we provide this energy by using fossil fuels, which unfortunately emits CO2 because of the two uses of fossil carbon in this reaction. First, carbon provides a driving force binding to the oxygen and leaving behind the metal. And second, these reactions often take place at high temperature, so even more fossil carbon is burned just for heating. All in all, we emit 7% of global emissions this way. And that doesn't even include the downstream emissions from taking those metals and turning them into products. What's worse, these emissions values are set to double by 2050, driven by increasing quality of life around the world. And that is an important sustainable development goal. So we need to be able to provide those metals, but we have to do so a different way. Our legacy reactors, like the iron-making blast furnace shown here, are not only inefficient and polluting, but they were designed and built so long ago, they're not even well matched to the ores that we mine today. Even with carbon capture as a stopgap, these legacy reactors have a limited lifetime. So let's envision the next generation of metal extraction technologies, and let's do so starting with a clean slate. Our vision is for the global production of metals using just air, water, and clean energy as inputs. The first step in this journey is mining, and while it's upstream of the processes I'll talk about today, I encourage you to stick around for tomorrow's Fast Pitch session, where Dr. Doug Wicks will discuss the future of mining without waste, and Dr. Elizabeth Schoenfeld-Troen will show us how green plants might even do our mining for us in the future. But once we have these ores, how will we extract their metals? There are 3 criteria that I think technologies need to meet. First, we have the opportunity to provide novel reactor types that are more energy efficient than predecessor technologies. And second, they have to be 100% clean. Now, we do have reactor types that meet these 2 criteria today, but unfortunately, they're not amenable to large-scale production. And so that's going to be our 3rd criterion, inherent scalability of the technology to meet global metals demand. So nobody can probably drink the amount of soda that I've shown here on the screen, but you get the idea. We make and use a lot of aluminum. So in summary, we need clean, efficient metal extraction technologies that can scale. Let's spend the rest of today's talk discussing a few categories of research questions that, if answered, could enable technologies to meet these 3 criteria. And first up is an all-electricity route. These are known as electrolysis, electrowinning, or electrodeposition, and they do exist today at small scale. But unfortunately, there are 2 main drawbacks to scaling them up: high cost and slow throughput, so we can't scale them up right now. But could we re-envision these technologies? Let's dive into a hypothetical electrolyzer, shown here with its 2 electrodes. Metal oxides or their derivatives are dissolved into a conductive medium known as an electrolyte. Then a voltage is placed across the 2 electrodes, driving this reaction, producing metal at the cathode and oxygen at the anode. Now, there are many technological opportunities to decrease cost for this type of system. 2 examples include providing inert, so non-corroding electrodes, and providing ways to decrease overpotential, to decrease the amount of energy that we use in these systems, decreasing the amount of electricity we'd have to purchase. And to increase rate, we need to break through the current limitation of these systems, which is the surface area of the 2D electrodes. So we're interested in hearing from you. What are 3-dimensional electrode concepts? Also, we need to move from batch to continuous processing. So in electrodeposition, heat isn't always provided, but when it is, it's usually we do so by heating resistively. But that's not the only way to provide heat electrically. Moving on to our second research category. Ouch! Oh, false alarm. This is an induction stove. It flows alternating current through a magnet, generating a magnetic field. Induction is more efficient because instead of heating an intermediate like the air of an oven or the surface of a burner, this magnetic field passes straight through that burner surface and directly heats the metal by inducing eddy currents. Now, if we want to heat metals and ores, let's use a non-conductive pot to contain them in. And when we place metals in this pot, they'll heat up due to these eddy currents. Now, this strategy, induction, is actually used in the metals industry today in roughly the manner I've indicated here to heat up metals. But today, it's only used for metal melting, not yet for metal smelting, that is, metal extraction from ores. So, could an ore stew be heated electrically, whether by induction, microwave, plasma, or other efficient electrical processes? Now, we still have to drive off the oxygen. Could we do so perhaps chemically, bubbling, for example, clean hydrogen through the melt, producing water as a byproduct? We're interested in engaging with you on strategies to use chemical reductants and combine them with heating from electricity. Moving on to our final research category, let's zoom out. Taking steel as an example, the value chain from ores to products is really long, and it includes multiple reheating and remelting steps that waste energy. But could we provide a shortcut around this long value chain? For example, going from ores to metal products in one pot. We're interested in processes that can skip several steps or even create new, better materials in one go that aren't available on this value chain today. If you're excited by the research challenges and opportunities I've discussed in this talk, please reach out, whether you're here at the summit or watching the recording online afterwards. We've just released a request for information. The acronym is SMELT, and it's live on our online funding opportunity web portal. The deadline for input is in a couple of weeks, so please check it out. Let's create the future of the metals industry together. Thanks so much, and back to you, Scott, to close us out for Q&A.
Okay, we have a little over 20 minutes for Q&A. I believe you all have been busy entering questions. Okay, here we go. We have a question for Jen Shafer. Jen, would you consider use of big data in the citing of repositories for RAD waste, RCRA waste, and or other NIMBY waste repository using databases with population densities, natural phenomena, hazards, acceptable or unacceptable geologies, etc.?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. You know, I would consider the use of big data for anything that would basically help advance things in a meaningful way. And so if there were thoughts out there that people had regarding how data could be used to understand and drive waste disposal, I think that that's certainly a central part of what would be necessary for this. You could certainly look at town hall information or other types of information that might be out there that could help inform these pieces and try and fuse it with what we already know, basically from kind of a humanistic point of view. So I would.
Thank you, Jen. I see I got a softball question. What do I think of Bob Mumgard's vision of 10,000 fusion plants by mid-century? Well, so I think all of us know that, you know, energy deployment is very difficult and slow, and this is a known challenge. So, but I think the good news is we are thinking, I think the fusion community is thinking of ways to speed up deployment, and there are ideas we can borrow from the nuclear industry as well, things like modular construction, etc. I think what we need to do is look at the hope of the early pace of nuclear deployment as something to try to replicate, and we will work hard to achieve as rapid a deployment as possible when fusion is ready. Okay, Zach, do you see your question?
No, I don't.
I'll read it to you. Not sure how colors are assigned to H2 production, but pink has been assigned to hydrogen produced by nuclear power. Is this unlikely candidate for green produced hydrogen?
I'm not sure. Get the question. Can you repeat the question again?
I guess the gist of the question is, do you feel that nuclear is a likely or unlikely candidate for green hydrogen production?
I think it depends on the market, and you know, it's certainly a possible route by utilizing the waste heat from nuclear reactions, you know, to split water. That's one way to do it. But I'm of the view that it will be multiple technology in the marketplace in the end. Depend on special purpose, depend on availability, the location and so forth.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess, let's see. We have one for Christina. Thanks for your presentation, Christina. I'd like to ask you which metals are the highest emitting?
Oh, yeah, great question. So if you recall from my first slide, so I said metal smelting accounts for 7% of global emissions. Again, this doesn't include downstream emissions from turning those metals into products, but just primary metal production. So steel represents the largest share. So of that 7%, so 5.5 percentage points of global emissions, the vast majority are from producing iron to make steel. And then second is aluminum, which is the second largest at just under 1% of global emissions. And then the remaining 0.5% or so are all other metals, chromium, magnesium, copper, and then going down from there.
Okay, thank you.
I can add to what Christina said is, that's the total emission from steel and aluminum. But of course, on a per kilogram per ton basis, other metals like titanium will emit a lot more, aluminum emit more than the steel, but we don't use as many tonnage.
Okay, thanks, Zach.
Yeah.
We have a question for Peter. What does ARPA-E think the role of hydrogen could be in the future of transportation?
First, that's a very good question. And there are many diverse opinions on hydrogen. Hydrogen, I think, is an excellent energy carrier because it's easy to produce in a distributed energy carrier production vision. It is a little bit challenging to use on some platforms, especially if you want to keep it in the liquid state or highly pressurized. I think the future of that hydrogen as transportation fuel will be determined over time. I think there are many paths for it to be very relevant. Hydrogen could easily be produced and then later reformed to maybe a different carbon chain, or new technologies could be invented to make that pressurization and liquefied storage on a platform possible. So I think it's definitely going to be an important part of our energy carrier mixture for the future, and I look forward to work on technologies that can realize that vision.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Another question for Jen. I believe that words matter. Should the expression safe nuclear change since nuclear has such a bad rap?
Yeah, this is a great point and a great observation. It would be helpful if we came up with a better way of discussing this in general, because nuclear technology, at least as far as everything that we know about it, is it's an incredibly safe technology. And so, by having a phrase reinforced like safe nuclear, it almost kind of reinforces the idea that, or maybe some baseline, maybe less informed fears that, nuclear is a inherently hazardous technology. And so this is something that we should be careful of and thoughtful of. And, in general, I'm open as well to ideas about how we improve that language, or maybe just, not always underline the safe in front of nuclear, just nuclear. So, yep.
Thank you, Jen. Okay, I see there's a question for me. Can you describe in a little more detail how public-private partnership programs will accelerate fusion development, and why now? Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think there's two main considerations here. In my fast pitch, of course, I discussed the scientific readiness of fusion to take that step. But I think mainly getting the private sector involved really focuses the R&D emphasis on the problems that matter for a commercially viable demonstration. And secondly, the private sector will bring the amounts of capital needed for a rapid development and deployment that will keep the US in the leadership position. Okay, let's see. We have more questions showing up here. Zach, would you consider biological approaches to H2 production?
I'm not a specialist in that area. I certainly think, I'm of the attitude we should not rule any possible path out. Certainly, you can go through the using bio approach to produce hydrogen. But as I mentioned in the video, on this approach currently are more expensive than water electrolysis. The point of the video is let's think out of the box. Let's see if we can design multi-step and new reaction pathways, and then that could potentially bring down the cost. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question for Christina. What about metal recycling and demand reduction? How big of a role can these strategies play?
Great question. Yes, absolutely. I think it's so important to investigate and deploy all strategies, and those two are really good examples. So at a high level, demand increase for the growing global middle class for all these metals is projected to be large. So like I said in the talk about doubling annual demand by 2050. So to my mind, it's hard to imagine that we can do demand reduction severe enough to completely flatten out use. And of course, even if we did flatten out use, we'd still require over a gigaton of primary metal production each year. And so we still do need to be providing some of that metal in a primary way. And part of that is because metal stocks take a long time to turn over. So you don't buy your car this year and then recycle it the next year to make way for another car. Of course, there are lifetimes with these things, car stocks, building stocks, et cetera. So there's no way you could really rely on end of life scrap for all demand, even in the medium term, even if there was severe demand reduction. Having said that, we do recycle a lot of metals. Aluminum is the most recycled metal, maybe 76% or so of global aluminum is recycled. So we're doing well, and we could do better. Excited about all these options. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina. Next up, Peter, instead of liquefaction, would pressurization work too?
Scott, that's a great question. When you think about pressurization, there's definitely a path to also make fluids liquid. For ammonia, especially, that's a pretty viable path, because ammonia only would require about 10 bars to be liquefied. If you're looking at hydrogen, that's 350 to 700 bars. So that is a little bit challenging. And the technical challenge then becomes, how do I make the pressurization vessel lightweight enough that it doesn't impact the energy density of that fuel? And if you consider transportation vehicles, there's a lot of safety requirements that come into play as well. I think it's another path that could have some technical hurdles that we potentially could solve.
Okay, thanks. Jen, is there a reference for your Twitter analysis that nuclear is less popular than coronavirus?
Yeah, so that was, I had it at the bottom of the screen there, so sorry if you missed it, but basically those were out of some preliminary findings from a graduate thesis, actually. So there hasn't been a chance to get that published yet, but that's what it is. And to give a little bit more clarity on that, so this was, I believe, done using centistrength, and so you kind of have a spectrum of words that on a scale of 5 to -5. And if you looked at COVID versus nuclear, COVID was maybe at about -0.5 if we're using this kind of arbitrary scale, and nuclear was maybe about -0.9. And so it was, that was kind of eye-opening in that regard. And there's a lot of different ways that I'm sure that you could run those types of analyses depending on which Twitter data set you've had. And I also imagine that I've seen some preliminary information kind of looking at word clouds as well. And depending on where you pull information from your word clouds, whether it's Twitter versus, how things were messaged to the broader public, right? You see very different messaging aspects of this. And so these are all things that we could potentially learn something from. So long answer to your short question, it was out of graduate thesis with reference there. And please don't hesitate to follow up if you have other questions.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, Zach Fang, does the cost issue of the green hydrogen from electrolysis come from the low-cost green electricity?
That's part of it. Of course, the cost depends on a high level two factors. One is the cost of energy we provide, and that's the cost of green electricity, and that's coming down. That's good news. And the second, of course, is the efficiency of this reaction. As I mentioned, we're looking for reaction pathways. Electrolysis is one example of how we can break down the reaction of splitting water into the reaction at the electrodes involving electrons. So the efficiency of these reactions, of course, is another factor goes into the cost calculations. Whatever way new reaction pathway come up is this two. One is the cost of the input energy, and then the efficiency of the path that you choose. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Okay, there's a question for me. How does fusion fit into the context of deploy, deploy, deploy? So that's a very fair question. I guess I'd like to answer that by quoting Bill Gates in his recent book. He says, you know, that 2030 must be a milestone on the way to 2050 and beyond. And so I think the answer here really is that as part of aggressive deployment of existing technologies, we must also understand that a firm, socially acceptable, power dense, carbon-free source of primary energy, such as fusion, will ease all paths to global net zero, and which I said in my fast pitch, and that Bob Mumgaard also gave in his main stage talk. Okay, let's see. Christina, are there other material synthesis processes other than electrodeposition?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And sorry I didn't have time to talk about all the possible routes, but metal extraction is, of course, a really deep field with a lot of routes. So you could consider pyrochemical or thermochemical processing. And of course, that's largely related to what's done today with carbon sources, in addition to electrometallurgical processing. I mean, there are so many other ways you could skin the cat, whether it be aqueous or molten salt options, biologically mediated options. Yeah, it really runs the gamut.
Peter, please discuss the role of alternative energy in data efficiency.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? You broke up for a second. Please
discuss the role of alternative energy in data center energy efficiency.
Sure, this is another area of my great interest. Data centers are also a very large energy consuming area. And it's also an area that's going to grow. We saw earlier today a presentation from the team in Poughkeepsie trying to put data center basically in the pavement. The amount of sensors are going to increase exponentially over the next decade, and the energy use of data centers is going to be quite important. And fortunately, many of our data center energy, technology companies are looking at renewable energy to power those. But it doesn't mean that we can be inefficient. I think there's still efficiency gains to be made in data centers, especially if we get closer to the edge and in higher power densities. So I think renewable energy, every data center should be powered by it. And at the same time, we should still strive to make them more efficient. And I think those are still areas where we can improve upon. If you look at the computer chip and ambient, there's a heat flow that is currently being cooled by air conditioning. And maybe another goal could be in a future discussion, in a future fast pitch, on how do we eliminate some of those energy needs.
Okay, let's see. I think for Zach, perhaps, is the issue of developing a water splitting catalyst or better H2 storage more important or harder?
Well, I think it kind of depends on the application, right? So if for stationary storage as renewable energy storage method, I'd say the cost of hydrogen is a bigger picture of the entire cost analysis. But if you're talking about the hydrogen for fuel cell vehicles, for transportation applications, then the hydrogen storage is the biggest challenge at the moment. So we have to consider the production of hydrogen, cost of hydrogen production, then the storage, then the application, and that changes the cost structure, changes how you think which part is more important. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Christina, if there were abundant cheap hydrogen, would all of your challenges be solved?
That's a great question, and experts disagree on this point. So I must say there's room for many opinions. It's a really great question. Certainly, there is a role for hydrogen to play in metal extraction. There are some challenges, and abundance or availability or hydrogen transport and storage would go to solving many of those. There are still some drawbacks with the production of hydrogen-based direct reduced iron, taking steel as the elephant in the room largest example. There's still some sort of metallurgical challenges with the product iron produced that way. So I think there's still some opportunity to have more shots on goal and look at lots of routes, but definitely a proponent of Zach's ideas on clean hydrogen working, and they would have knock-on effects in at least steel production and the production of many other metals. Aluminum is produced electrolytically today, in part because it's really low on the Ellingham diagram. That is, it takes a lot of energy at high voltage to produce aluminum. Just aluminum oxide is very stable, and so hydrogen isn't considered a great option for aluminum, but there are electrolytic technologies that are being pioneered by folks. Actually, Apple and Canada are sort of teaming up to look at alternate routes for aluminum. So it sort of depends on the metal.
And if it's okay, Scott, for me to add to that, because I really, concur with Christina's assessment here. But the general picture is, if you have abundant renewable energy, does that mean we solve the problem? And I think there's a second part of ARPA-E's mission where we have to be efficient. And if there are paths to be increasingly efficient, we should do so. Unless the entire world is 100% powered by renewable energy and we have a surplus in the entire world, then it might be a different case. But at this place, if we would power something by renewable energy, but do it in an inefficient way where there's still potential to reduce the energy usage of that particular process or system, we could have alternatively used some of that excess energy to power houses or other things that are still powered by fossil fuels. So I think renewable energy we need to get to as much of it as possible, and at the same time make sure that the processes that we have are using that renewable energy as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, completely agree, Peter.
I think that those are great.
Definitely a system.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Jen.
This is all the time we have. I think we need to keep everyone on time. So sorry, there's a few questions left unanswered, but please ask the questions to us directly if you would. Come hunt for us at the coffee hours or send us an email. So I just want to thank everybody for the great attendance today, and to thank all the fast pitchers in this session. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.